Hi, I'm Steve Palumbi, and this is lecture 9 of the Science of the Extreme Life of the Sea. And today we're going to talk about the deep sea again. We're going to talk about a couple of different, very specialized habitats in the deep sea. Deep sea is dark and it's cold and there's very little food, but there's a couple of habitats that break that generalization. It's generally still dark, but the first of these specialized habitats isn't cold, and there's an abundance of food. And those habitats are hydrothermal vents. They are places in the deep ocean where the tectonic plates that make up the surface of the Earth are moving apart. And in the space of those tectonic plates, when they're pulling apart, there's magma pretty close to the surface. Ocean water moving through channels in the crust then gets superheated and also charged with a large amount of minerals, and that comes shooting out into the bottom of the ocean in plumes of very hot water. Minerals in those high concentrations in the water, which could be hundreds of degrees centigrade, dissolve, or they precipitate out, forming clouds of black smoke, it's called, in those particular areas. Now, hydrothermal vents are pretty well known from lots of different places in the world. Anywhere the tectonic plates are splitting in under an ocean is where you'll find hydrothermal vents. Some of the most famous ones are along the mid-Atlantic ridge. Others that are very, very well studied are along the coast of the west coast of North America or along the Galapagos Ridge. These areas have been known for a long time by geologists, but when they first went with submarines to go and take a look at them, they were astonished at some of the things that they saw. This image shows what are called black smokers. That is the hot water coming out with the mineral precipitating around. Now, this part of the image was something that those early geologists were perfectly expecting. They went there expecting to see these black smokers because they knew a lot about the basic geology of hydrothermal vents. But what was enormously surprising was all this other stuff. It turns out these are live organisms, whole communities of animals that live around hydrothermal vents, and were astonishing in their diversity and their abundance, because after all, there's very little food down here, and the conditions of the hydrothermal vent seem like they're inhospitable to most ocean life. Though temperatures can be hundreds of degrees near the plumes, and there's hydrogen sulfide and all kinds of other noxious minerals that are in the water. Well, that kind of surprise then led to questions about, well, how do they feed? What is supporting these communities? For example, if you look at a graph shown here of depths in the ocean and how much of the surface productivity manages to get down into those depths, you can see that up near the surface of the ocean, there's lots of primary productivity because of photosynthesis, lots of organic carbon, lots of fish, lots of invertebrates, the plankton, and that supports a vibrant food chain. But as you get deeper and deeper into the ocean, even a kilometer down, then only about 3 or 4% of that primary productivity is reaching a kilometer down. Once you get down to the depths of hydrothermal vents or the depths of the rest of the deep sea, the total fraction of this organic carbon from the surface that reaches there is very low, 1% or so. And it comes down in a very different kind of form. Remember that the bacteria in the ocean are constantly chewing away at the organic material. Organisms that die in the shallow part of the ocean are colonized and consumed by bacteria as they sink. And by the time those particles get down into the deep sea, they're mostly just flocculent sets of bacteria living on what was left of an organic particle. They're called marine snow, and that produces most of the food supply of the deep sea, but it's a very thin, very, very thinly distributed food supply. Well, the hydrothermal vent communities, particularly right around the black smokers, need a higher food supply than that. And so the question really was, where are they getting that kind of food? One of the earliest types of investigations was the strange set of worms that you can see here. They're called vestimentiferan worms. They live in tubes. They have a large red plume that sticks up outside the tube, and then the body of the worm lives down here into the tube, which is attached to the rock near these black smokers. They have an odd anatomy. This is one pulled out of its tube. With the plume here that was sticking out, the vestimentum here, and the trunk, but nowhere can you find a mouth. Nowhere can you find a gut or a digestive system in this entire worm. So not only is there very little food, but these worms, which grow very quickly, have no way of eating any food. Well, it turns out that the secret of how these worms live is how they get their food and how they use a different kind of chemistry to make it. In fact, the entire trunk of the worm here essentially is one big culture tube for bacteria. The bacteria live within the trunk, and they are fed the minerals that live around in the water through the blood supply of the worm itself. The blood goes through the plume. It brings in oxygen and hydrogen sulfide and delivers that to the worm's to the worm's trunk down here in the body. Well, what good does that do to the worm or the bacteria? It turns out that the bacteria themselves are pretty common, lots of different types all across the vent communities, not just in the worms. These symbiotic bacteria live in, say, mussels. These are bacteria living on the outside of a mussel shell in the hydrothermal vents, but there's also bacteria living within them and the other organisms that make up most of the deep sea. Well, let's dig into a little bit of what the bacteria are actually doing to make a living and how they can be symbionts that power this entire ecosystem. They can't be doing it with photosynthesis because there isn't any light. But it turns out that they're using about the same kind of chemistry with just tweaked a little bit. This is the basic equation of photosynthesis, taking CO2, combining it with water and using sunlight to essentially form the bonds between carbon atoms in large organic molecules with water and oxygen as a byproduct. And Van Niel at the Hopkins Marine Station and working in the 20s and 30s worked out this basic equation for photosynthesis using light energy to make this work. However, he also realized that it didn't have to be exactly this equation, that there's ways of substituting other compounds in this equation. In particular, it's possible to take CO2, combine it with hydrogen sulfide, and instead of the oxidizing potential of the oxygen in water being used, like it is in photosynthesis, it's the oxidizing potential of this sulfur. Then that can together allow the formation of organic molecules with water and elemental sulfur as a byproduct. But this still fails because there's no energy source here. Light is what drives this equation. There's no light driving this equation. So adding to this equation, we can add an energy supply, which is in this case oxygen. So CO2 plus hydrogen sulfide plus oxygen allows the bacteria to take the CO2, make larger organic compounds with elemental sulfur and water as a byproduct. That allows the bacteria to take the strange chemistry of the water pumping out of the hydrothermal vents because of the magma close to the surface and use that plus oxygen as a way of producing organic food for the entire community. Other versions of this don't have to all use hydrogen sulfide. Some can use methane, some can use other sulfur compounds. The point is that it's a way of creating organic food without photosynthesis to start with, without light energy to start with. So back to this diagram of the worm itself, the bacterial culture here in the trunk is fueled by hydrogen sulfide and oxygen being pulled into the the blood supply of the plumes, pumped down by the worm into the trunk, produces the organic food for the bacteria and for the host itself, allowing the worms to grow very quickly in these communities. The whole bacterial cycle within worms or other organisms in the hydrothermal vent allows these animals to essentially step aside from the normal photosynthesis of ecosystems that live in the photic zone of the ocean. And it creates a totally different way of fueling these abundant and diverse sets of communities. That's why it was such a surprise to people when they first went down in submarines, because an ecosystem fueled by something other than photosynthesis had really never been seen before. In part 3 of this lecture, we're going to talk about a different aspect of vent communities, and that's their stability. The vents themselves, because they're in very active tectonic zones, are enormously productive, but they don't last very long. Not only that, but the actual vents themselves have to be balanced just right between the amount of water flow, the superheated water, and the surrounding areas in order to support life for any period of time. And so they don't actually produce communities that last for centuries. They might last for decades. The black smokers, by precipitating all those minerals, grow cones up around them, and they eventually clog them themselves off. Also, the magma underneath the tectonic plates shifts, and that means that the source of energy for these communities is constantly changing. So the organisms themselves grow very quickly. Essentially the entire structure around which they can live their lives pretty quickly disappears. And then maybe a new vent will open up a kilometer away or 10 kilometers or maybe not. So how do these animals actually then spark the next generation? What happens when their vent site dies and another one opens up? Well, like most organisms in the ocean, especially the invertebrates, they produce eggs and larvae that are mobile and that can swim from place to place, and that the only way then a vent community, a new one, can get colonized is by larvae from other vent communities coming in. So that means that the larvae themselves, when they're produced, have to find other vents, maybe a kilometer, 10 kilometers away. And they might actually very, very, very seldom be able to get 100 kilometers away. Now, the ridge systems themselves are thousands of kilometers away. And so the other bigger picture is, how do these communities move from one section of the ocean to another? So in this particular simulation, oceanographers have taken current patterns that they have measured around a hydrothermal vent and modeled how a larva might actually be pushed by those currents across the ridge of the vent system. So the ridge itself is this gray line. The star here marks the place where the simulation imagines that a larva is produced. Now, these larvae are quite small. They're less than a millimeter. They're swimming, but they can't really swim against currents, and so their movement patterns depend mostly on the movement of the water mass that they're in. And so what you can see is the projected path of this larvae moving around, and only a couple times does the path of the larvae actually hit where the ridges are, and only a couple times does the path of a larva hit where a vent system might actually be able to be found. So the larvae themselves have a fairly problematic life. Finding the next place to live is very difficult for them. It's conceivable that larvae can actually go a reasonable number of kilometers, depending upon how long they can stay alive in the water column. And this simulation says, well, if they're alive for 8 days or 16 days or up to 40 days, then what distance can they go? And then what's their survival probability? So the survivor survival probability drops off dramatically over time, and the distance that they can go goes up. In this case, in this particular simulation, it's possible for these larvae you can imagine them going up to 60, up to 90 kilometers from their site of origin. But by the time they're pretty far from their site of origin, their survival is quite low. And so it's a balancing act between high survival close to their site of origin and low survival far away from their site of origin. What that means is that the movement from one vent field to another is relatively unpredictable. Once a few organisms, a few larvae manage to colonize a new vent field, well, then they don't have to go very far. And if they can stay put and settle right there, then they have high survivorship at low distance from where they came from. So the process of colonizing a new vent effectively is a chance colonization from a set of larvae that might be going a long distance, chance survival of a few of them that settle, begin to grow, and then spark the new community. In the fourth part of this second lecture on the life of the deep sea, we're going to talk about a very different kind of habitat. It's deep, it's dark, it's cold, but it's full of food, and it's full of food for a very spectacular reason, and that's that large animals in the ocean that die can fall to the bottom, not like marine snow, but in the case of whales, as large chunks of potential food for a large number of creatures that live on the bottom of the sea. So whale falls end up being an important part of how these ocean ecosystems manage to keep all kinds of different organisms alive. This particular video from the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary shows a whale fall on the Davidson Seamount. And as it comes into focus, you can see the front end of the whale with the large jaws. This is a baleen whale, was a baleen whale, and those are the jaws that held the baleen. And all around this whale fall, this whale carcass, you can see a wide variety of different organisms that have clustered in to take advantage of this big food supply that is dropped right into their laps. You can see here sets of fish that swim in, but also sort of remarkably whole clusters of octopus that have come to feed on the skeleton and the carcass that's been left there behind. But this is the first stage of that process. And in fact, researchers over time have described a number of different phases that allow different kinds of organisms to come in and take advantage of the whale carcass in order to basically break it down. And the kind of set of different organisms taking advantage of one habitat and how they change that habitat to set up the next set of organisms to use it is generally called in ecology succession. There's one phase of organisms, one relationship with the habitat, then gives rise to the conditions that favor a different one. And the succession for whale falls starts with very mobile predators, hagfish, sharks, octopus, but then that exposes most of the bones. The bones aren't as good a set of food for those mobile predators, and so there's a set of worms and crustaceans that come in and begin to feed on the rest of the skeleton. And then when only the stripped bones and the big bones are left, then there's another set of very specialized animals that come in and begin to consume the bones themselves. So the mobile scavenger phase involves hagfish, other fish, octopus. This is just one shot of a whale carcass covered by hagfish that are sort of squirming all across it, eating the fleshy parts of the carcass that are left after the animal has fallen to the bottom. Then the second phase has been called the enrichment opportunistic phase, and that is where the rest of the carcass begins to be colonized by more slower moving invertebrates that come in from the surrounding area. In this case, you can see some starfish and some sea urchins actually beginning to chew away at the carcass itself. This phase, along with the mobile predators, is what removes most of the flesh from the bones of the whale fall itself. Then the last phase is called the boneyard phase, where the exposed bones are then the source of food. And it doesn't seem maybe that a set of bones lying on the bottom of the ocean would be a particularly strong source of food, but whale bones are special. They are full of oil. That oil helps them stay a little bit more buoyant when the animal is alive, but that oil also is a great food supply for this set of boneyard scavengers that comes rolling in. And probably my favorite one of all is a specialized worm called Osedax, or its Latin name translates into the bone-eating snot flower, and it's very, very descriptive. The worms burrow into the bones of the whales. They have tendrils that go out into the oil-rich parts of those bones, but they have to have some part of themselves up in the water column in order to get oxygen in particular, and that's the flower part of this particular animal. It's also in a small tube that's very snotty, and so the bone-eating snot flower, like shown here, takes up a wide set of places on the large bones of the whales and begins to consume them from within. It's a strange life for this particular kind of creature. For a long time, it was thought that they could only eat whale bones, one of the most specialized types of food sources you could imagine. Although it has also been lately discovered that it's possible they could also do the same thing, eat the same kinds of structures on large bones of large fish that fall to the bottom. The anatomy of these animals is very strange in that they have a tube with the palps that stick out. That's the flower part. The tube goes down into the bone. The animal itself then spreads out and dissolves the bone around the base of the tube and then flows out into these areas almost like roots. That's where the ovaries are in this particular animal. And they then produce eggs that are essentially shot out the tube. But all of these large worms are all female. They're all producing eggs. But the males themselves are actually nowhere to be found if you're looking at the normal structure of these particular worms. In fact, the males are very small, almost microscopic. They are attached to the inside of the tube. The animals produce eggs and sperm. They make zygotes. They make larvae that float around. Some of those larvae that are going to turn into males find tubes of females, crawl down them, and attach. Essentially, then, those tiny little larvae turn into just sperm-making machines inside the tube. The females themselves are consuming the bones. They are spreading through them, basically breaking them all up, and then turning as much of their energy as they can into eggs to go out into the rest of the world and colonize new whale falls. Whale falls were pretty common because when there's lots of whales. Lately, though, for the last couple of centuries, as whale numbers have been dropping because we have been hunting them on the surface and not letting them fall to the sea, then the spacing between whale falls has gotten larger and larger. These particular animals have such a large amount of reproductive capacity, then they can send larvae out to find other whale falls out in the bottom of the ocean. A whale fall doesn't last very long. This succession from the mobile scavenger phase all the way to the bone-eating snot flower phase only lasts a couple of years, which means that in that period of time, animals like these that are sessile, they can't move themselves, have to have larvae that go out and find other sources of food out in the ocean by traversing pretty long distances until they manage to find the next source of food, the next whale fall.